Welcome. My name is Jennifer Caius. I am a customer education manager here at Mentor Collective, and I have the awesome job of getting to put together some educational events for our partners on how to best use our product to help all of your mentorship initiative needs. So today's event is the second part in a three-part series on performing your own impact analysis. Today's event will focus on melt and term-to-term persistence. So let's get started. As we're diving in, just a couple quick housekeeping tips. This webinar is being recorded, and we'll share the recording with you, of course, afterwards in a follow-up email, along with some additional related educational resources. On the screen, you can check out a few best practices for ensuring that your virtual experience today with us is seamless. I'll hand it over to our presenter for today, Annemiek Rice, in just a sec. While Annemiek is presenting, I'll also be available to answer any questions that you might have in the chat. And of course, we'll also have space for you to come off mute and ask questions live at the very end during a Q&A. So as I said before, this is the second of a multi-part series on the value of conducting your own impact analysis. This part will cover using impact analysis data to connect mentorship to MELT and to term-to-term persistence. We explored how to glean the impact of mentorship on sense of belonging in our first session, and I'll drop the recording link to that in the chat in just a sec, and I'll also include it in follow-up messaging after today's event. The third part in this series will be held at the end of October, and it connects mentorship's impact to academic progress. If you've signed up for one of the events, you have access to the recordings from all three, actually. And I'll drop the registration link in the chat so you have the date and time for that last session on your radar. In today's event, you will be learning about connecting mentorship to retention, about multiple approaches to using your data within your institution to enhance the effectiveness of your mentorship programs and your overall student success strategy, keeping MELT and term-to-term persistence in mind. And Annemiek will also cover some practical ways to translate data findings into initiatives that create stronger, more inclusive learning environments. All right, to get us started, I have a little poll here to get to know each other a little bit better, to understand where you are at in your data journey, your impact analysis journey. So you'll see there should be a poll that just launched. So it will ask you which best describes your professional role, if you've attended the first in this series, so we can just get to know each other a little bit better and understand how to meet your needs. It looks like we have some student services or enrollment folks here, some academic affairs folks. I have a good split of people who attended the first event in the series. All right, and then that third question, how would you describe yourself as a data expert, a data enthusiast, or a data novice? And I love seeing these answers, mostly data enthusiasts. So Annemiek, keep note, people who maybe love data, they love the impact that data can have on their mentorship initiatives, but also could really benefit from some coaching here. Also quite a few data novices, so this should be a really helpful session for you. And we also have some additional resources that we'll highlight at the end of today's session that could be really beneficial for you. Lastly, we asked, which of the following have you done before? Have you exported data using our platform? Have you pulled data from your SIS, done a VLOOKUP before, used pivot tables, or none of the above? And we really have a healthy mix there. So a little bit of all of those. Some people answered all of those, some people answered none of those, so a real healthy mix. And most folks are about somewhat confident with some gaps to fill on their ability to conduct an impact analysis. So this should be really helpful for everybody. I'm so excited to get started. All right, so your research team behind these guidelines for the impact analysis. This was developed by Dr. C.G. Heiser with contributions from our very own Annemiek Rice and Mentor Collective. A quick bio on CG. Dr. Heiser is the founder of Co-Creating Action. She is an award-winning researcher and a seasoned professional in education, evaluation, and strategic planning. She teaches anti-racist methodologies at American University. She also teaches contemporary issues in higher education at New England College and assessment courses at the Student Affairs Assessment Leaders. She's led assessment, evaluation, and strategic planning initiatives really across sectors. And recently, she contributed to NSF grants supporting underrepresented students in STEM and conducted qualitative research on factors that influence students' choices in pursuing their post-secondary education. CG developed the impact analysis guidelines as well as the recommendations for using the analysis data to create institutional impact. And you can find the full guidelines in our Partner Knowledge Center. And of course, I will drop that link in the chat as well. Annemiek Rice has spent her career in higher education guiding institutions in their journey to use data and tech more effectively. She's consulted with hundreds of institutions across the country seeking to accelerate their practice of student success, learning assessment, and institutional effectiveness. She is currently Vice President of Partner Success here at Mentor Collective, and previously she served in the same role at Anthology. She's worked in academic advising, strategic enrollment management, accreditation, assessment leadership, has authored publications on the topics of equity-centered assessment, and served as a speaker and consultant for the Center for First-Gen Student Success. She served as a consultant in building the guidelines, and she'll be the speaker for today's event. And with that, I will transfer it over to you, Annemiek. So excited to have you here to present.
Thanks, Jen. Thank you all for joining me today. I'm really excited that we have so many data enthusiasts and novices in the room. And because I helped write the poll, Jen, we didn't allow you a choice for like data averse or uninterested in data. I'm assuming that if you're joining us today, that you're at least curious, if not looking on building some competency. So just want to add that it's really exciting to get to talk with all of you as we walk through these frameworks and these examples and these research reviews that we've compiled. This is really based on things that have come out of conversations I've had with many of you one-on-one about what you are attempting to do or striving to do at your institutions and what some of the gaps are that have prevented you from getting there. So our goal today is to try and give you some frameworks and really practical things to help you get through that, and to create a listening loop here where you can tell us, okay, this was great. It helped me with A, B, and C, but I'm still struggling with these next two things. So as you're listening today, and as we're providing you with some of these tools and tips, please don't hesitate to say, I wish you'd answered this question. I wish you provided guidance on X. Jen and I will be paying close attention to what else we can do to make it easier for you to assess impact and demonstrate impact. All right, so today's topic, as we mentioned, what we did is essentially looked at all of the research on mentorship and found all of the things that had a lot of peer-reviewed backing for the impact of mentorship. So our series is based on the main things that the field as a whole have agreed to in terms of the impact on mentorship. So last time we talked about sense of belonging. Today we're talking about MELT and persistence. Next time we're talking about leading academic indicators. There's certainly more than that list, but those are really key three areas. I thought it might be helpful to start by defining some of those terms. And really, when we talk about MELT and term-to-term persistence, these are very specific metrics within a broader concept of retention. And I'm sure all of you care about retention, and your jobs are tied to retention, and your reason for partnering with us has something to do with retention, but it can be very complicated and it can have dashboards of 72 different indicators. So we're really talking about two very defined metrics that are subsections of retention today, and they're the ones with the most evidence in the peer-reviewed literature that mentorship should move the needle on these. So first quick definition is MELT. MELT, if you've heard of this, you may have heard MELT, you may have heard summer MELT. most often tied to the admissions or enrollment journey. So we want students to apply to our institutions or enroll at our institutions if they're open access. We want them to then choose to attend our institutions, and we want them to actually follow through in that matriculation. And then we want them to continue to enroll. So MELT looks at how many students who decided to attend. They applied, they were admitted, or if you're open access, they admitted, and then they actually enrolled. And usually for many of us, that's the fall term. There is this gap called summer melt between a group of students who say, I want to go to Hometown U or Hometown Community College, but then they don't actually end up showing up on day one of classes. And that's called melt. This number, we want it to be as high as possible, getting it as close to 100% as we can. And the indicator that we often use for melt is deposit. That indicator might change at your institution depending on how you ask students to commit to earning a credential or enrolling in courses at your institution. If your better indicator is just a confirmation that they attend, you might use that. But many, especially four-year institutions, will use a deposit as that indicator of their intention or commitment. This is not to be confused with yield. Yield is the concept of I applied to the school and then I decided to go. So we think of yield as the journey from applying to accepting, depositing, and then MELT is the journey from depositing to enrolling to actually showing up, usually on day one of classes. So these are the indicators we'll look at today. So why does MELT matter? What do we know about it? How do we calculate it? So calculating MELT really simply, MELT is kind of a negative indicator. So whereas persistence is a positive phrase indicator, we look at how many students deposited, we subtract from that how many actually enrolled, and we divide it by the denominator of all deposited students, and then we turn it into a percentage. That's what the times 100 is. So we had 100 students deposit, 90 of them enrolled. That gives us 90 divided by 100, which is 10%. So 10% of students melted, meaning we lost 10% of them. Melt rates are often really tiny, just depending on your institution. It's a great question to ask your institutional research office. Most of you on the phone are not institutional resource officers. So you're going to go to your campus website or you're going to contact your IR professionals and say, what's our melt rate? And you're going to feel really smart because you're going to know what melt rate is, and they're going to tell you some number, and it's going to be not 90%, right? So it's going to be 5% or 8% or 15% or something similar. And that means the percentage of students who we thought were going to come but actually didn't show up. The other concept, which I think is probably more common with our institutions, is term-to-term persistence. Sorry, let me pause for a moment. MELT would be a relevant indicator for you and your mentorship program if you introduce mentors and mentees before matriculation. If you introduce mentors and mentees at some point before that first day of classes, there is evidence, as we will talk about shortly, that that relationship can decrease your MELT rate, can decrease the number of students who decide not to enroll, can increase the number of students who show up, in addition to increasing their preparedness, excitement, all of the other things. So if your mentorship program's matching happens over the summer prior to the fall, or if it happens in that winter term before they start in January, you should be thinking, ooh, MELT impact is something I should look at. Okay, moving on, term-to-term persistence. So retention is often spoken of in the concept of just generally how many students return, but the ability to come up with the calculation on it is really quite complex. There's a lot of exclusions and definitions in there. Most of the data on mentorship impact actually looks at term-to-term retention or persistence as opposed to year-to-year. That doesn't mean that year-to-year impact isn't there, but term-to-term is the most short-term leading, quick indicator. It's also something that you can assess a little faster. So if you have a program where you invite folks right now to participate in mentorship in their first term, you don't have to wait until next year's matriculation to do an impact analysis if you do a term-to-term persistence analysis. Persistence and retention are often seen as synonyms, but we tend to see persistence used more often to describe term-to-term as opposed to year-to-year. But this basically means how many students were here in the fall and came back in the spring. Now, if you're a quarter institution or a trimester institution, you're using different seasons for your term names. But essentially, what is the next large term that they're in? Most institutions, if not all, will exclude things like summer term or winter mini-semesters because they're generally not typical cadences of enrollment. So if you're at a semester-based institution, you're going to look at fall to spring or spring to fall. If you're at a trimester institution, you're going to do fall, winter, spring, whatever it might be. All three of those terms would count. And so you want to be aware of that fact that we wouldn't consider spring to summer a valid term-to-term persistence rate. These are also, this term-to-term persistence is most closely studied by most institutional research offices for first-year students, although it's not irrelevant for continuing students. You certainly can look at what we call the sophomore slump if you're a traditional four-year institution, for the spring to fall kind of drop-off that can happen for those students. You might be very interested in juniors moving on to senior status. You could look at degree. We'll talk about leading academic indicators in our next session, but generally speaking, this is the most common metric for first-year students. It is often in your institutional research offices reported alongside a metric of year-over-year retention. Year-over-year retention is a required metric by IPEDS. Your IR office is preparing reports for IPEDS to publicly report this information. So year over year is pretty much always known. Term-to-term persistence is not as much a required metric. However, it is a much more actionable one for you. So it's something we are highly recommending you consider, again, because it's found in the research. We also typically, if we don't expect first-year students to go from their first term to graduation term, but if for some reason you're looking at a persistent study of upper class students or closer to degree completion students like your second year community college students, you do get to exclude the students who graduate on the positive side. They're not considered to have not been retained because they graduated. So that's what term-to-term persistence means. And so typically timing-wise, we know if students are persisting by either the first day of classes in the next term or the census date, which is the usually drop add date at your institution, which is often 2 to 4 weeks into the term. How do we calculate persistence? This is a pretty easy one. How many were here yesterday? How many are here tomorrow? So we had 90 students that came back in the fall. Of those 100 that deposited, 75 returned in the spring. So our term-to-term persistence rate is 75 over 90, and that is 83%. How do these have anything to do with mentorship? What we know in decades of peer-reviewed literature research, peer mentor outreach over the summer decreases MELT. So there's tons of studies that say, and they're all cited, some of them, many of them are cited, especially the most recent ones in the guidelines that Jen shared. Especially for students who are historically marginalized, and especially when mentor pairings take demographic data into consideration. So you might be an institution who is targeting Pell eligible students, or targeting TRIO students, or targeting a certain region of the country that you're really trying to increase MELT in, or you could offer peer mentorship to all students. And you would want to see the MELT rate decrease, especially if you were making sure that the mentor that they were paired with was someone that they had something in common with. And that's where, if you're using the mentor collective matching survey and making good choices about your questions and your weighting, et cetera, that's going to happen. So we have lots of evidence that that's the case. The second thing that there are many, 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 many studies about is that there is a positive relationship, a meaningfully positive relationship between receiving peer mentorship and persisting to the next term, especially for first generation students, although again, there's lots of demographic deep dives that you can take on this as well. So this is really why many of you partner with Mentor Collective, is because you know this is true, and you're also trying to make sure you collect and show the data this way at your own institution. Finally, most of this research, as I already said, of impact on retention focuses on term to term as opposed to year over year. There are plenty of studies that show that year over year retention also increases, but the expert recommendation coming from Dr. Heiser and I here is that if you are conducting an impact analysis at your institution, we strongly recommend you look at term to term in addition to year over year, if not instead of year over year. And that is what we've built as our formula for you. So I want to add before we get into the play-by-play on how to do this. There are some nuances to who the population is that your institutional research office will report for your retention rates. And a really important fluency element for you, if you are not already an expert in this, is to look at your IR's website, look at those dashboards, and ask really good questions about which students are included in this statistic. Is it all students? Is it students below a certain credit amount? Is it students who are, for instance, most institutions at this point still only report retention rates for first time in college or FTIC students, and they do not include transfer students. But your intention of your mentorship program could be to increase persistence of transfer students. So I would not recommend you exclude them from your analysis or from your mentorship program, but you don't want to compare your data to an institutional data set that is different. You want to be able to say, this assessment included FTIC and transfer students, or this assessment included first term enrollees at our community college who had less than 30 credits accumulated. You want to be really clear about that parameter so that if someone in IR is comparing that to another dashboard or data set, they don't say, hey, why is your number so much higher, lower, or different than mine? Because that can really lead someone to question the credibility of the data that you're gathering. So again, knowing those terms and the difference between them can be really important. All right, so now understanding the impact of the mentorship program on these two concepts. How do we do this? What do we consider? We have some suggestions, and for the few of you who attended our Sense of Belonging webinar, or for those of you who are planning to go to the next one, you're going to see that we're using the same framework for our suggestions each time, so that you can keep doing this for every one of the impact areas and not have to reinvent the wheel. So, setting a meaningful target. First order of business, grab your pen, go to your institution's website. What are the current persistence and melt rates for your students at your institution? First year, first time in college, sophomores to seniors, whatever kind of area you're looking at, you want to look those up on your institutional website. Look those up through iPads if you can, or ask your friendly data geek in the institutional research office to share that information with you. You can also ask, how do those rates differ by subpopulation? Do we see a difference in MELT for students from outside the state versus students that are more local? Do we see a difference in persistence for students who come from a first generation background versus students who are continuing generation? Is there any particular gap that we're looking to close, or any particular subpopulation that we might want to focus on, so that we can say something like, maybe the overall retention rate or persistence rate of mentored versus non-mentored students is 1%, but maybe it's 10% difference when that student is first generation or Pell eligible, or whatever else you might be focusing on. So knowing where you're at first, what your institution cares about, where they're trying to move the needle is step one. Then you want to think, what's the target? Your strategic plan might say, we want to increase it by 5%. We want to get into the 90th percentile. We want to see it move. We want to see closing of equity gaps, whatever might be there. You want to know what those are and potentially set some target rates, either again for persistence or MELT, depending on whether you're studying both or one of these. Then we want to say, okay, mentorship is one of many things we're doing to move the needle here. Is there a range of that number that we would consider success? Is it a 2% increase? Is it a 10% increase? Like, what's the difference that we would be looking for here? Is it a certain percentage in the first year, and then we drive that more over time? And then where we might want to adjust or enhance our interventions because we're not seeing the impact that we want. So once you have a sense of what your targets are, and again, you're probably not setting these, you're probably finding out what they have been set as more so than anything else. We want to look at what the data is telling us so far. Once we have the data together, which we're going to teach you how to do, what are we noticing overall? Do we see that we're higher at or below my target? Do we see any differences in demographic groups? You should see differences in demographic groups. You should be looking at that. That's definitely a strong recommendation here. What are our opportunities to celebrate? Where do we have the need to do some interventions? And many of you are having conversations with us through the summer about that. Like we saw the impact we wanted with FTIC students, but we didn't see the impact we wanted with transfers. So how would we approach the way we develop and design our mentorship program to maximize that? Are there little kernels of success that we can extend? Are there places where we pivot or change our model to try and maximize the effectiveness? For example, if we know our melt rate is really, 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 really low in our business school, health profession schools, et cetera, we might want to target our mentorship program at the College of Liberal Arts and the College of Engineering, particularly to push our resources to the places where we want to see the biggest impact. And then we want to say, what is the relationship between all of these things? So when a student is mentored to match, what's the melt or persistence rate for participation versus not? And then what is the rate for them based on these different demographics? So really looking at how these different layers of data connect. The last thing we want to do is make an action plan. We suggest you do this actually before you have the data. Like, what am I going to do with this when I find it? And then when you do have a conclusion that you're really thinking about what I'm going to act on. So if we see that students who are mentored through the summer are more likely to enroll in the fall, we're obviously going to keep doing that. And then we're also going to share this maybe with our FYE offices, our provost council, and our goal is just to keep it where it's at, right? You might find it something different. You find that we've got term-to-term persistence impacts, but we don't have melt impacts. So we want to move the timing of our mentorship program a little bit earlier to see if we can get some melt impact, right? How do we do it? This is literally going to be step by step. For those of you who said, I haven't downloaded a file from Mentor Collective or I haven't done an XLOOKUP. Spoiler, you're about to learn. So, and everything that we are about to show, my colleague Lauren put together for us based on these templates that CG created. You can go back and play these videos later. They're 3 minutes each. You can see step-by-step instructions on exactly what to do. You're going to access the actual Excel template that you can download and edit yourself. You are not starting from scratch here. So what I think you can do is instead of furiously taking notes right now, if that's where your head is at, just try to stay with the math, follow along, and know that you can refer back to this guidebook as many times as you need to. 6 steps for impact analysis. The first step, really important, can't skip it. Who are we assessing? Which we really got to define that student population. We have to be very clear, especially when we're sharing this later, with who was in the population served. So if our mentored population was first-year students and students on academic probation and students who transferred in, we really need to be clear that that is the population we're assessing, or you can decide to segment them and assess them separately. You want to know what the size of this population is. So if you have 11, you're going to have a hard time with a statistic. So you do want to be a little honest with yourself about how many students do I have? How far down can I break in these demographics? It doesn't mean you won't still report on it, but you always want to say the count of that or the N was 385, 281, 1042, 69, whatever that number may be. And then you also want to put the time frame. So the analysis was about students who were enrolled in a certain term, but you also want to say something like they were invited to mentorship in May versus they were invited to mentorship in September, because that does change some of the impact we expect to see. So write all of that down and be very clear about it. The next step is to get the data, identify the data you want and the data you need. On the Mentor Collective side, today we're just focusing on a couple basic things for this foundational assessment, but you can add as much else as you want. So you really want to have ID, which is our matching metric here. We have to have institution ID lining up in these 2 files, your unique, never changing, your institution's ID. And then role, which would be mentee or mentor. And then program status, which we have a definition of in our documentation, which would include were they matched, were they just invited and they didn't actually match? And that's how we know who was mentored and who was not. There is lots of other data in the system. If you want to go beyond what we are proposing today, you can break things down by how many conversations they logged in their mentorship, or what their goal was for mentorship from the matching survey results, or what the answer was to the sense of belonging question, just like we talked about in our last webinar. So when you download your data from our system, it will have 8 million columns in there. There's a ton in there. You only need 2 of them to do a basic term-to-term amount analysis, but it could be helpful to grab a little bit more, keep it in your file, and let yourself get curious and dig into some more data after this. On the student information system side, so what am I requesting to be pulled for me? Again, number one important thing is I need to make sure I have the right population up front. If I ask my IR office for a pull of data for all first-year students, and I don't tell them I also mean transfers, I'm not going to get a complete file. So you really need to make sure that you're clear about that population up front. In the future, you can consider pulling this at the same time as your invitations, some of this data, so that you know right now some of those demographic variables and other things. All right, so institutional email is kind of like our secondary matching thing. So if we can't match on ID, you might look to email to see if you can figure out who that student is. And then we're going to look at the basics of, did they deposit? Did they enroll? Did they enroll in the next term? Did they enroll in the next year? So you're going to want to change those from next term to what the next term is. You're going to say fall 2024 enrollment, spring 2025 enrollment, fall 2025 enrollment, right? You're going to be really clear about those timeframes. And then you're going to add meaningful demographic variables. These are up to you. Again, the research would lend itself to you asking about first gen, race, ethnicity, Pell eligibility, and potentially like commuter status, like local or further, as things that you would want to look at, but you can look at whatever you want. All right, so next we're actually going to obtain and merge the data. So I'm going to play this video that shows you where to find this in our platform and how to get it queued up.
When conducting an impact analysis, you will need to first gather and prepare your data. In this video, we will walk through how to export data from Intercollective's partner dashboard, clean up the data set, and add any necessary calculated fields. Let's first walk through how to find and export your data from the Mentor Collective partner dashboard. Once you are logged into the dashboard, you will want to navigate to the exports page on the left-hand side all the way at the bottom. There are multiple options for exports, but the participant data export provides the most comprehensive information about the students in your program. In this example, we will be exporting data specifically for mentees. This is an example of what you might see when you open that downloaded CSV. Now, you will also likely need data from your student information system. You can use that system's process for exporting data or work with the relevant offices at your institution as needed to gather the appropriate data. And this is an example of what that data may look like. Now you have data from both your student information system and Mentor Collective's dashboard. You will likely have more data than you actually need for your analysis, so we recommend deleting all of the data that is not necessary. I personally find it helpful to highlight all of the columns containing data that I need for my analysis and then simply delete the rest. To select multiple columns, I'm going to do Command click on a Mac, or you can do Control click on a PC and select all of the columns that I want to delete or drag across. And then you'll do Control click or right click to delete those columns. Now that we've deleted all of the irrelevant data in our data set, we have a much more manageable amount of data to work with. You may also need to add additional calculated fields. In this case, we're going to add a column to calculate MELT. We already started with a full list of students who deposited. So now to determine if each particular student melted, we'll look at the column enrolled in fall of 2022. If they did not enroll or an N is listed, we would consider that student to have melted. If they did enroll or have a Y listed, then they would not have melted. We can quickly determine the melt data with the COUNTIF formula. In this first cell, we will type equals COUNTIF, open parentheses, and then the range, again, we're just looking at this cell in the enrolled in fall 2022 column. We'll type a comma, a quotation mark, and for the criteria that this cell needs to meet is equals N. Close the quotation and close the parentheses. So this means that we are checking if the enrollment status for this student is N, or that they were not enrolled in fall 2022, indicating that they did in fact melt. So we'll go ahead and enter this formula, and we can accept this suggested autofill to the rest of our column. So this formula will return a 1 if the conditions of the formula are met. So if N is found, or it will return a 0 if the conditions are not met. In this case, if a Y is found. If it helps to have a reminder of what a 0 and a 1 means in this data set, you can create a quick key. So melted would be represented with a 1, and not melted would be represented with a 0. And now you have all of the data necessary for your impact analysis.
Great. So this might be very remedial for you if you've done COUNTIFs before. You might even have more advanced ways of working with spreadsheets. We're largely building things here that work for those of you who are in the novice or enthusiast category and not PhD statisticians, which certainly is most of us, right, that are trying to run some student success interventions. All right, so up next is the step where we need to actually merge the data together. When we grab the data from this and from the Mentor Collective, we actually have to line them up so they look like on their same rows, and we can start doing these. What if they were mentored? What if they weren't? How does that affect things? So we're going to walk into that step now.
Because we often need to pull data from multiple sources, you will need to merge the data into one data set for analysis. In this video, we will walk through how to merge data gathered from your student information system and Mentor Collective's partner dashboard. This merge is possible by identifying a unique common data point in both data sets and conducting either a VLOOKUP or XLOOKUP to pull related data. In this example, I'll be using a VLOOKUP, and the unique common data point in both data sets is the institution or the school ID. So we're going to start in our dashboard data exports page, and we want to pull in the MELT data from our student information system data. So I'm going to create a new column and label it MELT, and we're going to start our VLOOKUP. We'll type equals VLOOKUP with an open parentheses, and it automatically tells you what you need to include in this formula. The first thing here is the search key. This is the key that we want to use to look up information in our second data set. In this case, we're using institution ID, as I mentioned, so we will click on this first cell. We'll enter comma, and next we need the range. This is where you want to look for the search key in the second data set. In this case, that second data set is our Student Information Systems tab. We want to make sure to include that search term, which is university or school ID, and then drag it over to the column we want to import, which is MELT. We'll add another comma. And next we need index. And this is the column number in the range we've selected containing the value you want to import. In this case, from our search value, MELT is the third column, so we will type 3. Another comma. And finally, is sorted references whether you want to return the approximate or exact match. In this case, we want an exact match to our institution ID. So I will type false and close our parentheses and click return. This is now showing the MELT data for this first individual in our data set. To expand this formula for the rest of these individuals, you can just double click on this little circle, and it applies the formula to the rest of the column. If helpful, you can also copy over this key that was created into our new data set. And now we've merged all of our data into one data source and can begin conducting our analysis.
Ta-da! This is the magic, the first step that we need. Something that might happen for you at this stage is that you will find rows that say NA or can't find or something similar. This would mean that the ID that you're looking up didn't exist in the second file. I have yet to do an impact analysis with perfect data. Pretty much always find situations where we have some kind of record that doesn't match to the initial file. And your options for reconciling those are either to say in your analysis, we looked at 972 records, 4 of them could not be mapped. I'm going to set them aside to say there's like a little error rate of 4, and I'm going to not include them in the rest of my analysis. Or you can actually look at those row by row to see if you can figure out who those students are. Is there some kind of typo in the record? Were they a duplicate of some kind? Did they have a missing institution ID, but they do have an email? So you can look up their ID and enter it. So that's one of the cleanup stages that like data scientists will say 90% of the work of data science is getting clean data. If you end up where you have things that don't work at this stage, that's because you have a little data cleanup to do. Or you just need to acknowledge that I don't have perfect data and this is the percentage of data that I'm excluding because I couldn't align it. All right, next up is where we create a pivot table. These are very fun. How do we take all of these rows of data and turn them into that overall statistic that we want to look for? Pivot tables are power. They're super fun. They're really helpful. They're a great way to make sense of lots of information, and they're very fast and quick, and you don't actually need to do any math in your head. So Lauren's going to walk us through that.
One of the best ways to quickly summarize and categorize a large amount of data is to create a pivot table. In this video, we will walk through how to create a pivot table for your impact analysis. We're going to use this data set for our pivot table, and we're specifically interested in comparing MELT for those who participated in the mentorship program compared to those who didn't. You can see that we have a column called program status, but there are quite a few different statuses here, a little bit more complicated than just participant versus non-participant. So we're going to simplify this data before creating our pivot table. So let's create a new column called participant status. And we need to decide what will count as a participant and what will count as not a participant for all of these different status options. For this analysis, let's just say that we want anyone who is currently matched or their program status is matched to count as a participant, and everyone else is going to be considered not a participant. And we can quickly determine that data with a COUNTIF formula. So in this first cell, we're going to type equals COUNTIF, open parentheses, and select this first cell in program status for the range with a comma. And then the criteria that we're checking for is whether the status is matched or not. So we'll do an open quotes equals matched, close quote, close parentheses. The all caps or all lowercase doesn't matter here, and we can click return. We'll accept this suggested autofill to apply that formula to the rest of our columns. And now you can see that this returns either a 1 if the conditions are met for that formula. So if the program status is matched, or it will return a 0 if anything other than matched is the program status for that student. If it helps to have a reminder of what the 0s and 1s mean for this data set, you can create a key just like we did for our MELT column over here. So let's just create a new one for participant and not participant. A participant is 1 and a not participant is 0. And now we're ready to create our pivot table. So we want to select all of the data we might want to include. So I'm just going to select everything. So clicking in this top left corner, doing Command Shift right arrow, Command Shift down arrow, or you'll do Control Shift if you're on a PC. And then we will do Insert Pivot Table. We'll go ahead and just add this to a new sheet. And now we can select the data we want to import into the table. So for our rows column, let's go ahead and select participant status. And for our columns, we can include MELT. And for the actual values that we're interested in, that is also going to be MELT. But instead of a sum, we actually want to look at a count. And specifically, a count A is generally best practice, as it is the best option to get a count for all cells regardless of the type of information. It doesn't have to be a number. In this case, it is. So count would have also worked, but best practice is to use count A. And now we have a pivot table comparing MELT to students' participation in the mentorship program. Again, if you can't remember what the 0s and the 1s mean, you can always refer back to the keys that we've created here. And now you're ready to create a pivot table for your impact analysis.
One of the things to consider here is just being really well versed in what the different stages of program status mean in Mentor Collective land. Lauren has helpfully put those types of definitions in a lot of our documentation so that you can understand, in your case, if you want to include students who were matched and then exited the program, or if you only want to include students who stayed in the program the entire time. Now we need to get to some of those frequency tables and percentages and things like that. So we're going to move into the next step of further reducing the data to help us get to the point of interpretation and analysis.
When you create a pivot table, depending on the data you're using, it may be simple enough to interpret immediately. However, it may make sense to create a summary table for easier interpretation and rate calculations and reporting. In this video, we are going to walk through how to create a summary table. We're going to work with this example pivot table, and this analysis started with all students who deposited in fall of 2022. And ultimately, we want to see melt rates for these students and if there are any trends in melt rate, depending on if a student participated in the mentorship program or not. If you conducted this analysis yourself, this data may be clear enough to you, but to anyone else, this may be too confusing or unclear to interpret. So let's start with a summary table. I've created kind of a template here with the title, some color coding. You can do your own branding, but we want to start adding some labels here. So we want to specifically look at participant status. And instead of using things like zeros and ones, we actually want to use the terms that are most understandable, like participant and non-participant. We'll also want to keep the total counts as well. And then here, we want to get the count of enrolled students in fall of 2022. We also want the count of melted students. And again, we want the total. Now, this is all data that's just from this pivot table. But in addition, we want to get the percentage of each of these data points as well. So the percent of enrolled students in fall of 2022 and the percent of melted students. These are likely much more useful in comparing to any internal benchmarks or targets that you may have. So now we actually want to fill in this data, and we can start with copying over all of the data from the pivot table itself. So in this pivot table, you can remind yourself what the zeros and ones mean with the keys that you created. And we'll just transport some of this over. So for this first cell here, this is referencing non-participants who did not melt, in other words, who did enroll. So this is 516. They're non-participant and they did enroll, so 516. And we'll copy over the rest of this data from the pivot table. Now that that's filled out from the pivot table, we still need to calculate the percent of enrolled students and the percent of melted students. So for the percent of enrolled students, we will calculate this with an equal signs. And we need to divide the count of enrolled students divided by the total. And this is going to auto-suggest filling to the rest of these columns, which we want to do. And then we will do the same for melted students, but instead using the count of melted over here. So equals count of melted students divided by the total. And we'll accept that autofill. You can fix the colors here to make it look a little nicer. And now you have a complete summary table, which is much easier to interpret and to share with other stakeholders.
It's always a best practice in these situations to include percentages and counts together. So a frequency table would have the rate or 10% as well as the n, so that you can also see things like, well, maybe 10% is only 2 students versus 10% is 200 students. So very good practice. And in our templates for melt and terms from persistence, we do include the two of those metrics side by side. Now that gets us to the point of the conclusion and what we want to do about it. I like to put my impact statements right next to my data so that people are looking at those charts and graphs and they're seeing that suggested interpretation or conclusion alongside of it. For something in this simplicity, mentor students are much more likely to enroll in the fall than students who are not matched and mentored, right? So now if we keep going with this analysis and you follow some of the other things in the template, maybe you break this down by demographic. Maybe you also do that term-to-term persistence calculation. So you're going to have more richness to your data when you follow those recommendations than in our simple example here today. So that's step by step how we do that. When you get comfortable with things like finding your data, merging your data, cleaning your data, working with pivot tables, there are certainly 7,000 different ways to do this. What we wanted to do is give you one simple way that most folks can follow along with to do it. So you're welcome to start riffing on that or using some additional tech savviness that you might have. But any of those analyses and interpretations need to be applied and used in order to have meaning at your institution. So as always, for every one of these webinars, we'll remind you of the best practices around assessment in higher ed, final tips for success. Sharing this data is very key. As I mentioned previously, that means you need to have really tight definitions. You need to understand your stakeholder audience. You need to think about whether I'm sharing this data with an institutional researcher or whether I'm sharing the data with my student senate. Am I sending a quick summary up to my vice president or vice provost? Or am I digging into it with a team who's going to want to see the details? So when you're sharing data, keep in mind that the level of nuance and the level of description is going to adjust. Really also engaging those groups in problem solving. So let's say you get into that and you see, I'm seeing melt overall is really impacted, but I'm seeing something inverse or opposite than what I expected for students who identify as Hispanic or Latinx. Why might this be? I need to think through this. I want to bring that to the table with another set of peers or colleagues and have them maybe dig into data with me, help me think through why those findings might be, or problem solve and consider how to apply them. Always look for areas to celebrate. Every executive loves getting a quick little stat or data point that they can throw into a board meeting or a president's cabinet meeting or a newsletter or an accreditation report. I've been chatting with some of you as I've been on the road here who are doing reaffirmations and reaccreditations. So pull out those numbers, get them to people who need them and can use them. And then also make sure you remember there's narrative to these things too. So in our last presentation, we talked a little bit about you can dive into the testimonials section of your Mentor Collective platform to grab a couple videos or written testimonials from your students, put those right alongside your quantitative metrics. Don't always stick with just the numbers. Make sure you have some of the qualitative as well. All right, Jen, that's our wrap of our step-by-step guide. Why don't you help us wrap up for the afternoon?
Yeah, that was awesome. Thanks, Anamik. Feeling a little bit more data savvy. Yeah, so I want to start by just launching the same poll that I had earlier, just that last question. So right now, how are you feeling? Are you feeling better about your data capabilities? Hopefully a little bit more data savvy. Are you feeling like you still have some gaps to fill? Maybe you would like some additional time to process everything you just watched. Or maybe you'd like to chat more with the Mentor Collective representative to support some of those data questions, whether it's something as simple as like, how do I do a VLOOKUP, or something a little bit more complicated, like how do I apply these analyses to my student success strategies. So it's looking like I have a good mix. I have some very confident, I've got this, very excited to hear that. And most folks are in this somewhat confident bucket, so still some gaps to fill. Awesome. So you are in luck if that is you in the second bucket there, because we have all kinds of additional resources for you. So as I dropped in the chat and mentioned earlier, the full impact analysis guidelines will be hosted in our Partner Knowledge Center. The first one is already there. It's the sense of belonging one. And then the one from just now, on MELT and term-to-term persistence will be up shortly. We also will have a third part in this series on October 23rd to learn how mentorship impacts academic progress. And you can sign up for that using the link in the chat as well. I can drop that again here. And if you're looking for more one-to-one support, bring your data questions to our small group Ask the Expert session on October 28th. Anamik will be there, as well as some data experts that are in-house here at Mentor Collective. It's a really casual event. You can sign up for that. Be on the lookout for that in the monthly digest and MC Minute. That should hit your email. If it hasn't already, it should shortly. If you're simply just like, how do I do a VLOOKUP? Again, you can definitely come to the Ask the Expert session, but you can also check out our Partner Knowledge Center. So we have an article for you there, and I'll drop that in the chat as well. And then of course the recording for this and all of the follow-up content and anything that is relevant to this session will be sent out to people who registered for any of the events, so the first, second, or third one, in a follow-up message. And then finally, as always, email partner support. If you have questions, please email us here at partnersupport@mentorcollective.org, and we'll give a speedy response to your data questions. All right, that about wraps us up for today. If you have any questions that you want to come off mute and ask Anamik or myself, you're welcome to do so now. Otherwise, if you don't have any questions, I hope you have a great Wednesday, and I hope I see you at one of these upcoming sessions. So thanks again for joining us, and thanks Anamik for all your support and guidance, and have a great day.